I have great parents. They were great parents to grow up around. I have all these wonderful memories from when I was a little kid, but during my high school years, I remember in particular riding to school with my mom every day and riding home with her every day and processing how the day went and the emotional stuff. It's high school. You can imagine all the things that are going on in my life, and having her be there and present. She was my music teacher, so we were at the same school all day. And having her with her finger on the pulse of things was wonderful, and I miss those car rides with her. With Dad, in addition to all the memories of sports and throwing the ball around like dads and sons do, one of the biggest things that I remember being awesome about his parenting was the idea ball that we used to play 3 or 4 nights a week. We would stay up super late. We're both night people. And one of us would put an idea in play with a medium to aggressive idea serve, and then the other one would hit it back. And then you get this rhythm going. And I saw this amazing 38-shot tennis point a couple days ago on YouTube. That's incredible just how controlled and disciplined both guys are. They want the other person to hit the ball back a little bit. And it's not until we've really worked that ball over that it's maybe time to consider looking to put one away. And Dad he has such a great sense of how to workshop an idea and what tone to strike when processing an idea. And even now, when I go back and hang out at Mom and Dad's place for holidays or just visiting or whatever, and we stay up late, I'm reminded of how dang good my dad is at idea ball. Now you might be thinking to yourself, everybody's good at idea ball. No, they're not. Try it with everybody. Not everybody is good at idea ball. Part of what makes somebody really good at idea ball is that they can read their opponent/teammate, depending on how you want to look at it, and they learn how to hit the right stuff and what pace to put on things to really get deep into it and enjoy the process together. Idea ball is something that, whether you agree with the perspective of the Pharisees in the first century or not, you got to give them credit for being excellent at idea ball. They knew how to work over an idea, and they knew how to debate. And there's this whole tradition of the rabbis, rabbinical tradition, that predates Jesus by a lot, and that has continued on to this day, where, you hear jokes about it and stuff, and you see goofy portrayals of this rabbinical debate style and like Fiddler on the Roof and things like this. But it's somebody throws something out and the other person says, okay, you make that point, you reference this rabbi, but could it not also be argued that this? And you bounce that back and the other person hits it back again. And to an outsider, it might seem like, we're not getting anywhere here. We're just hitting the ball back and forth. Why doesn't somebody just put it away? But for these guys and this kind of a style of idea ball, of debate, this is progress. This is getting somewhere. So something really interesting happens here in Matthew chapter 12 with the finer nuances of idea ball as it was played at this point in history. As we've looked at the last few days, Matthew 12 opens with Jesus' disciples receiving some criticism from the religious leaders of the day. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." Okay, the ball is in play. Now, this ball is not necessarily in play between two parties who are seeing eye to eye. This is an aggressive match of tennis, but there is a style to this debate. Now, for the last couple of days, we have been talking about the leading up to this moment in history, 500 plus year history of Second Temple Judaism and the oral tradition of the law. That is the unwritten law at the time of Jesus that went beyond the written law of what you and I might call the Old Testament, what a Jewish person would just call the scriptures, and this oral law that eventually gets written down in the Mishnah, which we talked about yesterday, a couple hundred-ish years after the time of Jesus. This oral law was passed down to generations by playing idea ball in front of people like my dad and I used to do growing up. And so you put a ball in play and you debate it and you argue about it. And maybe it gets a little bit heated and you get a little bit worked up. Maybe some people have a little more relaxed, more finesse idea ball style of play. But all of these different styles of play and all of this rhetoric served to promote the common memory and the refining of the oral law. So it is very interesting to note Jesus' response to these charges. The Pharisees put the ball in play. "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." And Jesus replies by getting out his racket and hitting the idea ball back at them. Oh! So Jesus answered, verse 3, "Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple desecrate the day, and yet are innocent? And then he goes on to make the rest of his argument that we'll have time to look at tomorrow. The medium is the message. You've heard this quote before, right? It's from Marshall McLuhan. What was his book called? Understanding Media or something like that. The medium is the message. How you communicate is what you're communicating in modern communication. And this isn't an entirely new and modern phenomenon. McLuhan is absolutely right. My phrase that I use all the time with this kind of thing is stuff means stuff. Books mean something different than a Kindle. All of that means something different than a scroll. All of that means something different than oral law. A speech directed at one party in a formal debate means something different than idea ball in the style of the rabbis. The fact that Jesus recognizes the style of communication and the idea ball that the Pharisees play and immediately gets out exactly the right racket and the right sporting equipment and hits the ball right back at them tells you a whole lot about how, one, Jesus is amazing at knowing his audience, and he always frames what he's communicating in a way that will deliver truth and clarity with exactly who he's talking to in mind, first and foremost. The second, it demonstrates an understanding that, okay, this is how you guys talk about these things. I am equipped to talk about these things too, and I'm getting into the third thing that it does. It demonstrates a competency. Jesus doesn't need paragraphs and paragraphs and hours of hitting the idea ball back and forth. Jesus doesn't play like my dad and I play. The ball gets put in play by the Pharisees, and then Jesus turns around and mashes the idea ball right down the line for an immediate winner, and that's it. Point Jesus. So how does he do it? Well, he says, haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? And again here, the medium is the message. Just note what his answer is. He answers with a question. If somebody comes up to you and they're like, hey, what are you doing? You can't do that. What's your first response? Is it to ask an insightful question about a king who lived 1,000 years before the time you're having the conversation? But when people accuse you, you defend yourself. Hey, I didn't see the sign. Hey, back off. I didn't even agree to those rules. Well, hey, pal, you do it the way you do it. I'm going to do it the way I do it. He doesn't do any of that. He immediately plays ball. So he asks a question. Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? Well, this is a reference to 1 Samuel 21:6. I just did a YouTube video about the Luke account of the same passage. So if you want to dive deeper on this or compare and contrast the two, you can go over to the 10-Minute Bible Hour YouTube channel and catch that video. But the quick version is this. You got a situation where David is on the run. He runs into this priest named Ahimelech. And theoretically, that bread just isn't for David, but Ahimelech notes the nobility and God-orientedness of David's cause and David's plight. And Ahimelech chooses to serve David, even though that bread is consecrated. It's, only to be consumed by the priests. It's for important priestly stuff that is laid out specifically in the law of the Old Testament. On paper, it could be argued that that was even maybe against the written law. It could surely be argued that it was against the oral law that had evolved in the previous 500 years in the culture of the Pharisees. Well, here's the brilliant rhetorical move that Jesus is pulling off. He's putting the Pharisees in a position where they hit an aggressive serve, and then Jesus winds up for an aggressive return, and the only way that the Pharisees can really hit the ball back is to criticize David. Well, David is like the greatest king ever, and he's like the guy from whom the Messiah is supposed to come, and he has a throne on which the Messiah is going to reign forever. David is clearly framed as being in the right, so they are reticent to go after him, kind of the same way in Luke 20-ish, it's around Luke 20, where the religious leaders approach Jesus in Jerusalem and they're like, where do you get off doing all this? Where do you get the authority from to do all these things you're doing? And Jesus is like, all right, I got a question for you then. John the Baptist, is his baptism from God or from men? And they have to go huddle up and they're like, well, I mean, if we say this, then everybody's going to be mad because they really like John. So they come back and they're like, well, we don't know. Well, Jesus used the same technique there that he's using here in Matthew chapter 12. He's putting them in a spot where they would have to criticize something that they just cannot rightly in front of anybody with a straight face, criticize, and he's outmaneuvered them rhetorically. But he's also making a larger point that we will flesh out more tomorrow. But before we get to the meaning tomorrow, there's a second component to this vicious shot that he hits back at them in the world of idea ball. And I said, or haven't you read in the law that on the Sabbath, the priests in the temple desecrate the day, and yet they're innocent? So according to the written law, Jesus is saying, the priests, they got to violate like all that stuff we talked about yesterday that ends up in the Mishnah about kneading and threshing and all of this stuff. But even though they would be guilty according to the Pharisees' oral law, I mean, clearly, spirit of the law, they can't be considered guilty for doing what God specifically instructed them to do according to the written law. So in two quick moves here, Jesus has demonstrated playing idea ball in the way that these guys like to play idea ball, in a format they're very familiar with. He's demonstrated the inconsistency of their thought, and he's now set himself up for the master stroke to go from the defensive return of their aggressive serve to now, maybe they get a racket on it and lightly tap the idea ball back over the net, and it's just hanging there at the net. Now Jesus has taken control of the point, and he's about to go for the gigantic smash that will put the point away, and the gigantic smash is what we're going to look at tomorrow. The other day I mentioned that the podcast here, our conversation is approaching 1,000 ratings and reviews on iTunes, which is, I think, a pretty cool thing. It means there's a lot of us involved in the conversation. I mean, 1,000 people have rated and reviewed it, and I got to figure most people don't do that. That's a pretty good indicator of where we're at. But it's a tie between Nate 338 and Eagle 70K. I can't tell which one of these two was responsible for rating and review number 1,000. They both wrote really, really nice things about the podcast, which makes me feel warm things in my heart. But to both of you, Nate 338 and Eagle 70K and Pert 93 and Creative Ben 001, and really to all of you who are kind enough to take a minute to rate and review the podcast. High five to everybody. It's really generous of you. Thank you. And truth to be told, it is way more encouraging than you might figure. There's a lot of words that just float around on the internet. People say stuff in their comments and things like that. This has been a constant source of encouragement, and that means a lot. So thank you. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.